Welcome back to the I-miev battery change module. Today, the original unit seen here, we're going to try and swap the batteries into my better condition, lower mileage battery tray from the earlier car. Here's a few detail differences and the repairs that I've got to do. The original battery tray, I had to cut a number of the bolts, particularly at the rear end, off because they were seized solid. Likewise, some have just pulled the centre core out. The core is a metal item that's screwed into the plastic background. Here is one such core. The early cars used this hexagon threaded bolt to go into the top of the thread in order to be able to locate and then allow you to undo it. The 12 months later car has this torque type heading, which again locates in and allows you to turn out, but equally so, the actual metal is identical. On this unit, I've only got about 5 that have unscrewed rather than sheared off, so I'm going to replace them with the decent parts taken from the other car. I will apply a Loctite in an effort so that they don't unscrew. These happen to match the type on the older battery car, so they were removed, and you can see evidence of red Loctite around the outside. I'm using some Loctite 2700, which is the high strength grade, and I'm putting a little bit onto the insert, the threaded insert that I want to put into the unit. These mount onto a hexagon. I then put a little bit of the thread lock on the inside. One repaired insert. I've replaced in total 4 on this side and another 5 or 6 on the other side, all of them screwed out. But that should make the lower battery unit complete with the really nice condition external ends that don't really need painting into a new battery tray. You can see the condition of the ends compared to the old unit, which is really disgusting. The trouble is that all this electronics is believed to be different, so the whole lot has got to come out and be exchanged. To remove this central electrical unit, there are about 6 bolts around the outside. 3, 4, 5, 6. Once they're out, the whole central unit becomes loose. You then have an earth connection and a power connection on the top. And then you've got to get this lead free. I've decided to leave this lead on the car because it seems to be the same and it's in better condition. And on the other side, I've loosened the rubber grommet on this side, which will allow all the parts to pull through rather than remove these aluminium sealed connections. I did decide to remove the cable on this side completely, mainly because these fittings here are designed for a smaller bolt, whereas the car I'm taking it from, my original car, has a larger aperture. Rather than drilling these out, it's easier to change it. Plus, I wouldn't have had to mess with either of these 2 fuses, which are actually done up quite tightly, and I really hope I haven't damaged them, even if I have spares from the other units. Let's get these 2 cables on. White on this side, black on this side. On the passenger side, I've removed the bracket that held these connections in view, and you notice there's the black, the round grey and the oval grey in that order. And because I've made this grommet pop out of its housing, these should go through that hole and be released. The rest of it I can leave as it stands. Again, I've got no connections under here to disconnect because they're all connected to the piece that pulls up. So the next bit is to pull that whole central section up. Of course, with my batteries removed, all the connections to the batteries are already disassembled. I have a little issue here of the inserts screwing out. They should be left behind like this. But unfortunately, they've unscrewed to allow the unit to come undone, but I've got to get these off without damaging the plastic. I could cut them off, but the heat will then damage the plastic. So to combat this, I've got a bit of angle iron, which I've machined with a grinder down to size, and that now fits this slot, so it will fit over there. All I need to do now is to machine a groove in there to go round the bolt, and then I can use it as a release tool. In true Haynes manual style, assembly is the reversal of the disassemble. So we'll put the connections through there first. We'll then lift the whole unit onto the assembly. Next, we can tighten them down. So the 6 bolts, get them nice and firm. The big battery packs, I've also got to change the internal circuits. Start with a 12mm socket, just undoing both bolts at each end. You need to undo both in order to be able to allow the sheet metal on the top. I find that if you take the top one right off and loosen the bottom one enough to allow it to come off so that it's free, you can then turn it onto its end. Next, with a screwdriver, you can twist and get the little indents to release. It will allow the top cover to come off. Next, very similar to the smaller packs, a screwdriver down the slots on this side and twist will allow it to come up, and then if you just pull, the whole unit will come off, and you can see that we've got the 2 red units which need to be changed off these decent batteries for the green ones on these old batteries that have come out of the car. Again, there is 1, 2, 3, 4 screws on this board, and there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 screws on this board. Both boards need to be removed and swapped over. First, use a crosshead screwdriver to remove the little screws. Same as the other batteries, with these little clips removed, the units are then free. You can then transfer them across to the new batteries, in my case. Connect them on this side, on here, and then make sure that they're in place on this side, and then very gently just push them into position and check that they're down. You've then got to put these screws in, and the other board is exactly the same. You don't need to disconnect it. You can get it to line up with the slots on this side, and again just gently push it into place so that the holes line up, and put the screws back in. I've discovered that whilst changing the battery units here, the BMS circuits, this part here is actually connected with these 3 little gel sections and wibbles very slightly. I've now been tightening these up and sometimes noticed that these move. So these rotate. If I put a screwdriver in here very lightly and just hold it when I'm turning it clockwise, it stops the movement. And when they're round the other way, like this one, I put my screwdriver in the slot here, and that just stops extra stress being applied to these little gel balls. I imagine the electrical connection happens between these slidey bits, and I think that's what these gel balls are for. But that's my take on it. With all the connections done, the lid will then just pop back into position. The cover will then just clip back down and pop on. Do make sure it's popped on properly. This back edge here needs to have these little tabs connected, and then you can reconnect the bits at the end. The completed unit can then go into its new home. 1 unit in, the other 9 to go. Getting there, but at least it should now be straightforward. 2 units done, along with the associated power cabling, which I've connected. I've even connected it back to the main central area here. So there's 3 units now working in. I'm now working on this unit and a 3rd pack. The power pack's coming along. These batteries on this side are now complete. The BMS is changed over. And I've just got to put the last power linkage in between these two, which I'm going to leave off for now. However, that does leave the old original power pack somewhat empty, with just the 5 packs on the far side still to be dealt with. Let's get on with that now. 2 more units added, so just 3 to go, and then the power pack's complete. 2 more to go, and the original case is now empty, so this can all be removed in a moment. And 1 more unit left to be converted. The last battery pack to be converted is finally dropped in. And we just need to then connect the last few bits in terms of the power lines and the connections. So there is a battery connection that the BMSs are connected to at the end of each one. I've had to click this back into the supports. This goes to the isolation. You can't tighten the batteries down tight until you put the connections onto the actual battery terminals. And I can't get my isolated tools in there, so I very carefully use a normal metal spanner, but you'll notice that every other connection, every other terminal is actually closed and not available to short circuit on. And the moment that that's done, I then cover it up with the protective cover. These internal battery clamps, I just do up nice and hand tight. I don't see any point in them being ridiculously tight. Whereas the terminals on the batteries, I know have got to be A, not shaken loose, and B, electrically quite tight. Right, so the front battery pack is now all interconnected, except for the positive at the end, which connects with the power in the middle. The rear battery pack is all connected, except for the little connection between these two and the connection between the end there and here. So I've got those to put in, which will then make the pack completely live. I'll go round the unit and just make sure that all the BMSs and all the connections are thoroughly connected, all done. I can go round and check every single one. Not forgetting, of course, the ones in the middle. Next up, to complete the front end, we've got the air duct that takes the warm air from the car into the battery pack. But before that goes in, you have to put this isolator unit here that's got the plug that you can get to from inside the car. So we'll just take the positive feed off here, which incidentally is battery 52. And we'll hook the feed on there, and then the other end drops onto the bolt on the fuse down there. These bolts actually need to be removed before we put the cover back on, because the cover then locates and bolts down. That then completes that unit. This connection goes into the socket under here and is just a good push fit. Make sure it is connected, and then the connection goes into there. This goes across here. And then finally the air duct. So the air duct is held down by these little plastic rivets, which I've saved. So the centres of the rivets pull out, and then you push the rivets into the unit, and then you push the whole unit down. Next up, we need to put the little connection on between these two batteries. Just torque those up. Good hand tight, firm, and although these are a little bit fiddly, they are well worth putting on. The two little tags go into slot at the bottom of the unit, and then the top half pushes into tags on the top. There you go, nicely covered, all done. So that's this side of the battery complete. So we come to the very last battery connection. And then put the caps back on again. And there we have it. Bar the covers, one completed unit, ready to go back in. I had just one bolt, this an earth tag shear, which I need to drill out and thread so that I can reuse it. With the drill nicely centered, I had to vice grip this because it's not actually welded and it kept on moving, but once it was drilled it was relatively easy to then tap M6. So that's the one issue fixed with the base. I don't think there's any other sheared off bolts to deal with. One fully repaired thread. Even some of the inaccessible areas of the car, like the inside here that was covered by the battery pack, is now accessible. So this has been rust treated and will be painted. But the rest of the car underneath is actually pretty good considering it's done 90,000 miles. Same problem on the other side. I did paint this area when I first got the car a little over 2 years ago, and it shows because A, it's black, and B, it's actually weathered quite well. But I may well paint that again as well while the battery unit's out. I think the battery's complete. So, better get the lid on. This is the original lid. Which goes on and matches up with all the holes. We've then just got to put the steel work around the outside. I decided to properly clean up the bolts, but to fully have a chance of being okay to use, I'm going to put some copper grease inside these little steel washers so that they don't rust. I might even put a smear along here as well. Each cleaned up bolt then had a smear of copper grease and then applied to the hole and then loosely tightened up, and we worked our way around the entire battery cell, making sure that every one was greased before it went in an effort to reduce future corrosion. Along the rear, brand new bolts robbed from the inside of the other battery cage were greased up because they really need to have the collar come loose, and then these were pushed into well greased holes and tightened up, and I'll also paint the heads before it goes back on the car. All the bolts around the outside, even the 4 that are underneath this hood, need to be tightened up. I haven't tightened them up to a ridiculous torque, just good hand tight. There's 4 under here. I've then tightened all the ones around the outside. Again, just using a normal short ratchet and making sure that they're tight rather than ridiculously tight. I don't want to pull those inserts that I glued in earlier. Lastly, much against factory, I'm going to paint all the bolt heads to try and discourage the rust. With the bolt heads completed, we can then start putting the traction cables back onto the clips in the appropriate places. You do have to make sure that they sit in the right places, so these actually do go on the inside, whereas this one at the end seems to go on the outside, and it's to do with where the clip is here. So with the cabling reattached, the earth leads all bolted back together and painted, That's the complete battery pack, bar the CHAdeMO and the power connections, which need to be done once the battery pack is back in the car. Underneath, we've just got to sort these cables out, which need to go onto this repainted bracket and attach to these bolt holes here. That's those connectors all nicely tied up. That completes the battery box, just leaves the two big connections. Right, the battery pack's gone back into the I-miev. I've not put the under tray covers on yet, but the CHAdeMO and the power to the car are all connected and the safety covers are on the vehicle. I've even remembered to connect this connector right at the back corner, which I very nearly missed. The original control battery was rather tired and has the larger terminals which are more difficult to find, but the unit only bolts on. So I've changed the complete battery negative and the positive part of the terminal to match the small JAP type terminal types, and this battery is from my spare cars, which I think is a lot better condition. So with the front battery connected and the power isolator orange plug under the passenger seat connected, I think we're ready to go. This is genuinely the first time I'm switching this car on. So we'll put the key in and let's see what happens. So if we turn the key on, we get a radio light up. So we got power in the car. Let's turn it to the next stage. Everything seems to light up, but we're clearly out of power. If we turn it on again, we get a ready, but we're in tortoise mode. If we put it into reverse, we have a working car. Now to see if it will charge.